Hello, and welcome to the Word on the Streets main stage. My name is Monica Warzeka, and I'll be your host during this next event featuring Heather O'Neill. Before we begin this event, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the history of the place where we're gathered today. The City of Toronto exists because of the Toronto Purchase, also known as Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation in 1805, with a final claim settlement in 2010. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit to care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace, which we all now share responsibility in upholding. The Dish with One Spoon was born in part out of the Anishinaabe concept of all our relations, which is the awareness that we are connected to and reflected in all the living and non-living beings around us. Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples with long histories on this land, and acknowledging this is only the first step in building a practice of land stewardship and Indigenous solidarity that honors these peoples. Now, please join me in welcoming Heather O'Neill, author of When We Lost Our Heads. Heather O'Neill is a novelist, short story writer, and essayist. Her best-selling novel, The Lonely Hearts Hotel, won the Paragraph Hugh McLennan Prize for Fiction and was long-listed for the Women's Prize for Fiction and CBC's Canada Reads. Her previous work, which includes Lullabies for Little Criminals, The Girl Who Was Saturday Night, and Daydreams of Angels, has been shortlisted for the Governor-General's Literary Award for Fiction, the Orange Prize for Fiction, and the Scotiabank Giller Prize 2 years in a row. She has won CBC's Canada Reads and the Danuta Gleed Award. Born and raised in Montreal, O'Neill lives there with her daughter. I'll now turn things over to her so she can read an excerpt from her new book, When We Lost Our Heads.
Hi. Thanks for coming, everybody. I'm not starting this right. I don't know how to get this in front of my... Okay. So I'm just going to start with a short little reading. And so this is the story, basically, of Sadie Arnett and Mary Antoine, who live in the Golden Mile and are incredibly wealthy and spoiled Victorian children who go on to destroy the city. But so this little part is just a set piece in the middle because Marie Antoine's father, Louis Antoine, he always he has a history of sleeping with the maids and servants, as was very common in Victorian times. So there's a moment in the book when I stop and I wonder what has happened to all his illegitimate children all over Montreal. All the Marys in Montreal. Although he did not know this, Louis was incapable of having male children. Every time one of his illegitimate children was pushed out of their wailing and hysterical mother's womb, the midwife announced the arrival of a girl. The mother found herself weeping even more profusely, knowing the baby didn't stand a chance in the world and would probably end up seduced and miserable like her. They grew up all over the city. Since Mary was the most common name in Montreal, many of Louis's daughters were named Mary. Unlike Marie, who lived in the Golden Mile, all the other Marys worked for a living. There was a Mary who worked with her mother as a leech collector. She waded out into the water with her arms spread as though she were involved in a religious rite. Her little plump body was covered in black leeches as though she had just grown mustaches in the strangest of places. Her mother yelled for her to stand still. She trembled as her mother pulled them off one by one, dropping them into a jar to sell to the doctor. There was a Mary who worked as a matchstick maker. She cut matches out of wood, dipped them into phosphorescent, and held them up to dry. There was a rumor that after you did this for a while, something quite ghastly would befall you due to the phosphorescence. She imagined one day beginning to glow in the dark and being able to read by her own light. She imagined one day her hair going up in flames like a match, and everyone who ever slighted her standing before her in fear. There was a Mary who worked as a chimney sweep. Her mother had cut her blonde hair short so she could pass as a boy. She climbed out of the chimney and was completely covered in soot, except for her brilliant blue eyes, which shone brighter than those of a boy. She held up her skinny black broom like it was the staff of a general, and she coughed out a little black cloud of soot. There was a Mary who worked with a man who passed as her real father catching rats. They sold them to the dog fighters. They would throw them into the rings to fight with the dogs. Her father wore leather gloves and picked up the rats by the tail. Mary couldn't look at their faces. They were filled with so much rage at their predicaments. She had a dream that a rat walked up to her and said, "I hate you," and she screamed. There was a Mary who lived with her uncles who were grave robbers. Her job was to stand at one side of the cemetery and keep watch for any intruders. She had a bell in her pocket. She was supposed to ring it if she saw anyone coming. When they opened a coffin, there was a thin girl with blonde hair holding flowers with white petals. The corpse was so fresh the flowers hadn't even wilted. They were all very careful with the girl's body because they didn't want to wake her. They whispered around the corpse. The last thing in the world they wanted was for the girl to wake up and realize she was dead. One day this Mary would take the bell out of her pocket and ring it, and all the other Marys would rise up from their graves.
Thank you. So for anyone who hasn't read it, When We Lost Our Heads follows this very intense friendship of two young women in Victorian Montreal, and that sort of very fierce bond ends up ultimately threatening the entire fabric of the city. You've written novels that have a bit more of a contemporary setting, like Lullabies for Little Criminals and The Girl Who Was Saturday Night, and your previous novel, The Lonely Hearts Hotel, takes place in the interwar years. So you're kind of going a bit back in time with this piece. What drew you to that particular era?
It was a lot of things. I was actually looking at images of Victorian girls in their crinolines and those giant cages they put on, and then I thought it was so interesting that they were literally living in these cages that were sort of metaphorically holding them back. And then also in the Victorian times was this moment when we codified gender behavior to such an intense degree, and we're still kind of dealing with those codifications of gender, with a woman trying to be passive, trying to be the not expressing anger, being gentle, taking care of the home, and this idea that any sort of display of emotion is tantamount to madness. So we still kind of live with those constraints. But I thought it was interesting I was going to drop Heather O'Neill characters into that setting and see how they reacted with their absurdity and sort of inherent resistance to it. And it would kind of highlight the absurdity of it and then also just show the ways in which we're continuing this struggle now.
Yeah. I've noticed that a lot of authors that we don't necessarily associate with historical fiction are kind of coming out with novels that take place in the past. Lauren Groff and Otessa Moshfegh both have recent books that take place in the medieval era. Anne-Marie MacDonald has a book coming out in the fall that also takes place in the Victorian era. I'm not sure, you can't really call it a trend yet, but I wonder if there's something about this moment where writers are maybe more interested in returning to the past, or if there's a bit more flexibility in terms of authors kind of exploring historical fiction as a genre.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think in the past, for a while, there was a trend of so many writers were writing dystopian novels and going into the future, and they were all like, there's a plague on the horizon, there's a plague, and it seemed so kind of ridiculous and some metaphor for how we, how we're human and whatnot, but they're like, no, there's plague coming, and novelists always have their ear to the ground and are a bit ahead of time, so of course, and the plague did come. And now society is we're living in this very sort of ahistorical moment where so many of the structures have kind of fallen or are mixed up. And I think it's interesting to go to the past because we're repeating all these battles that we've had before, even with the I deal with access to abortion in this book, and now it's become this sort of hot topic. And and in living in this time and sort of these political systems that try and convince you that there's some ideal little moment and everything sort of originated in the 1950s and we're sort of pursuing this capitalist nuclear family, when that's not at all what history has been. And there's been so many different ways of revolting and finding freedom. So, I mean, I just think it's that. I think it's this need to understand history more. Like right now I'm writing this novel that takes place in a sort of Eastern European country that's at war. And then as I was writing it, Russia invaded the Ukraine. I was like, this is not even historical anymore. This is entirely contemporary.
Yeah.
So I think the historical novels that I love are ones that kind of pursue contemporary issues, because all the characters in my book are just so modern.
Yeah, yeah. And how did you go about researching this book in that sort of Victorian period in Montreal?
Two ways. I mean, there's two parts in the novel. One is the Squalid Mile. No, one is the... Okay, so we start with the Golden Mile, which is based on the Golden Square Mile in Montreal, and it's still... The mansions are still up there. They've been turned into apartment buildings, or they're, McGill does strange research on animals inside of them, or whatever they're up to in these strange Victorian mansions. And so that history was kind of easy to have access to, because the rich and wealthy are always so interested in preserving everything they've done. And but then the Squalid Mile doesn't even exist anymore, and it was this neighborhood that, was down along the river where all these factories were being built up, and then you had all immigrants coming in, people from the city, people from Ireland, people from Russia. All over, it was this totally diverse place, and they built up these little shanty towns for them. And life was actually, it was... Everybody worked, but then at night there was a certain lawlessness to it in the way they presented, they entertained themselves. So when I was researching that, I really had to go into archives and just find little tiny details of, I read one, there was like this alley, and you went down the alley and there were children performing with a bear, and I was like, this is so wonderful, like all the sort of like hidden things in this lawless kind of area, and the ways in which brothels operated, and particularly how young girls were treated and how they had to work in that time. So that was all like a revelation. Everything was just like really, that was like funner to write, I think, in a way. Because first I was like, I'm going to write a book about the aristocrats, because I'm always like so like writing about the poor and stuff. So I created these grandiose characters, but then of course, like a revolution starts sparking of all these crazed little young girls who just hate Marie Antoine and Sadie for their bad feminism, start coming up the hill. And I was like, oh my God, here comes the Squalid Mile. And of course it becomes this wonderful exuberant. And everyone's like, I like the Squalid Mile. And I'm like, yeah, I just couldn't help it. I tried not to write about the riffraff, but then they just came out of the cracks.
Can't help it. Was there anything in your research that kind of made you look differently about Montreal, just going about your daily life there?
It really did. It was funny because I've always been so interested in Victorian novels, and I always adored them, but they were none set in Montreal, so it really kind of added the texture, because it seems like this missing layer. I think with Canada, we always are kind of removed from our history, from anything like, monstrous, like the genocide of Indigenous people, to just what life was like in the 19th century for immigrants here. So, it just made the city come alive, and it was a time when they were literally building the city from the ground up. So it was something about the people and their aesthetics and their little problems going into all that just made the city feel more alive to me.
So reading the book, it feels a bit like a chronicle or a fairy tale, and even though writing is very hard work, I couldn't help but feel like you were having a good time writing it. Did you want to talk a bit about the experience of writing this book?
Oh yeah, this book was a lot of fun, actually. And I think with novels, a novel is such a big chunk of your life, and you don't have friends in the same way that other people have friends. You're so isolated, so you just stay home, but you have your characters. And I really, So I really love creating characters that I want to spend time with. And so the first thing I did was create these characters, this cast of characters, and they were Victorian girls, and each one I kind of gave a drop from a character from the French Revolution. So one of the girls was Robespierre, and one of the girls was Marquis de Sade, another was Marie Antoinette, to give them that sort of spark of insanity. And then when I had them done, I was just like, oh my God, they're so much fun. They're so crazy, and they were all together. And then I put them on the page, and I didn't actually think, I thought Robespierre was going to be the protagonist because even as a child, I loved the idea of Robespierre, who was this orphan who had this incredible gift of speaking, and they would, the orphanage would tour him to meet like the kings and queen, and they were like, look at this adorable orphan, how beautifully he speaks, and he can speak to aristocrats. So he did that as a child, and then he grew up and developed this incredible power of speaking and writing, and then he went and turned France into this crazy bloodbath where everyone was losing their heads and being dry. And so I found that was so inspiring. So and I was like, I too could do something like this if Robespierre can. So I thought he would be the hero, but then but then Marie Antoine and Sadie Arnett, who are respectively based on the most problematic characters, Marie Antoinette and the Marquis de Sade, they were such narcissists and psychopaths that they inevitably, they just took over every scene because they had such dominant personalities. And then it was kind of interesting to me that the two principal characters were the most problematic. Like, they're both awful people, and yet I just adore them so much and their idiotic decisions, and even when they're in danger, there's just a loveliness to their presentation of femininity, which, they kind of almost do tongue-in-cheek.
As a reader, I kept falling into this trap where I just kept expecting them to turn things around. I think because they're women, that, the blonde, beautiful character would be angelic, and she would be so nice to her underlings once she rose to power, even though I had been reading and they were clearly awful since childhood.
Yeah.
I think there's maybe just the way we've been brought up to read these fairy tales where the women characters are so often the good ones that turn things around. Do you want to talk a bit about that and sort of playing with any expectations the reader might have?
Yeah, that was one of the fun things about the Victorian ideals of a woman. Like, Marie Antoine is the perfect Victorian child, and she just, she's like an Alice in Wonderland character, and she just does everything right, and she's beautiful, and she has these adorable mannerisms.
Everyone loves her.
So everybody, you would think, even when the factory workers see her for the first time, they're like, oh, here's a change. She's so lovely. But it's like, no, she's just feminine. She's completely evil. And she's so ambitious and narcissistic that in the same way Sadie, they're able to look at the poor and they're like, oh, look at you poor things. Can someone get this girl a turkey for Christmas? And then goes on her way because she actually has no empathy for them. And then it becomes a sort of realization by the other revolutionary characters, particularly with Sadie, that Sadie has. Because Sadie is a writer, so she goes down to the squalid mile and she draws all this, inspiration in characters and filth, and she writes this extravagant pornography about them. So in a way, you think of writer as a noble being, but then the revolutionaries start to realize she's worse than any aristocrat in the entire city. She's just she's here literally as an observer and to exploit us, and just for her own shocking persona.
So sugar plays a huge role in this book. There's a sugar factory, and beyond that, characters are just often eating cake, cupcakes, dipping their hands in sugar bowls, things like that. You recently wrote an essay for The Walrus that's basically called Let Her Eat Cake. Did you want to touch on some of, your thoughts on what it means in art to have women just consuming cake and sweets?
Yeah, that article I wrote actually because I was revisiting this new wave film from Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic now, by Vera Chilotev, and she had made this film, and it was just these two young girls, and they eat the entire movie. like everywhere they go, they just go into restaurants and they eat off people's plates and they just stuff cake in their mouths. And as they're expressing their, desire to be free, all they do is eat. And then the film got banned in Czechoslovakia on the basis of it was like anti-communist to have all these people wasting food, just throw it all over the place. So it was never seen. But there was something so incredible about watching these girls feasting. And then I was observing other films that were directed by women. And any time that there's cake put on the table, like the female characters go crazy and they're like, cake, you say. And people are like, don't eat the cake, don't eat. And they're like just eating cake all the time. And the cake just, they're so transfixed by it. And it was just about this idea of being told to limit your desires and appetite as a woman. So the act of eating cake on film, it seems revolutionary because women are not supposed to eat in that way and just like not be worrying about calories. They're just like, I'm gonna have sugar rush and jump on the table, So that was like a fun kind of thing to explore through different films. And of course, Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette, which is just completely covered in cake. And because I was dealing with a character that was based on Marie Antoinette, because she's been so associated with cake and the eating of it, and that was, one of the reasons given to hate her. That and sexuality, because what's interesting is that what people don't realize was that when Marie Antoinette was charged, before she was executed, she was charged with grand treason, but she was also charged with sexual crimes, as a sexual deviant of having sex with her son, all these things which hadn't happened, but it was so they had to attack the female body at the same time before cutting her head off and to kind of create this rabid hunger for her. So I thought that was always interesting, and it's kind of in the book where she's chastised, yes, for her enormous greed and just obliviousness towards lower classes, but she's also continuously attacked for her body and her sexuality, and people start making up these crazy sexcapades that she's been engaged in.
Yeah, and some of those sexcapades also involve food, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. It all comes down to, I guess, mistrusting appetites in women.
Yes, exactly. Mistrusting appetites. That's a good way to put it.
I guess before opening up the floor to questions, I figured we would end on a sugary note because of the topic at large. Do you have a go-to favorite dessert or sweet?
I do. I mean, I have a huge sweet tooth. If I could, I would just eat sweets all day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I had read, I think it was, there was some artist, Joseph Cornell, who I really like. And then I had read that he had just decided to eat cake his whole life for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I thought this was probably a possibility. But it isn't. But I just always loved that idea. But it always changes. But there's this, I kind of like, in Montreal, there's all these strange women who make cakes in these tiny little bakeries and alleys, and they've turned them into these.
Historically and now.
Historically and now. And it was, and when I was younger, because a lot of times when you're younger and you're a woman, you look at so many things that women do and you're told that they're crafts and they're uninteresting, which was something that was wonderful about the Victorian times, looking into the upper class, because they were all just supposed to spend their time sewing and making music so that it would look pretty. But when you look back on their artwork, it's extraordinary. They were these amazing artists, but everything was just like, oh, that's not fine arts, it's craft. So I, too, when I was younger, I thought whenever I knew like someone who was in arts and they'd suddenly dropped out to kind of make cupcakes and cakes, I thought they were insane. I was like, oh, the pressures of writing got to you, huh? You're making cupcakes now. How strange. Anyways, they're just incredible little, like, they make them so beautifully, and they're a bit overpriced. And there's this one woman who sells these rose cakes, and she puts rose petals on them, and then you eat them, and they taste like perfume and roses, and like you're eating a beautiful woman at the same time. It's very confusing. So that now is my favorite.
Nice. I feel like there was a missed opportunity where we could have just been eating cake up there. Yeah. Okay, I guess we'll open the floor to questions if anyone has anything to ask Heather about her book or writing? Everyone's shy? Yep.
So I love your book.
Thank you.
I have questions specifically about Goblin Market, which I think speaks to everything in the book and was
Yeah.
so perfect. And did you do that in advance, or is that something that sort of came up in the writing process?
That actually, okay, so the characters, they have to perform. Mary and Sadie, who are they love each other, but they're infinitely trying to destroy each other. So they enter a speech contest and decide to do the same poem, just to like irk each other. But I needed a poem, and I was looking for poems from the times, and then I wanted to. I definitely wanted it to be a poem written by a woman, and then I was just thinking of all the things, and then I was like, oh my God, like Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market. Like I haven't read it in so long. I hadn't read it since college. And it's always amazing to go back and rediscover something from college because you're like, oh my God, this is all about like sex and like so many things that you just don't understand when you're in college. And you're like, well, they're divorced, so what? Well, how could that take more than 3 pages to get over? So I went back and I read Goblin Market, and it was so perfect. And these two women who go into a goblin market and start eating this forbidden fruit, and they become just, one goes mad, and the other one kind of has to go and get her. And it's just like dripping with this strange sexuality of girls entering this sexual environment. And then when I was researching it too, I saw in the 70s that Playboy had done a series of illustrations. So I'm like, okay, I'm not the only one. It's just not my general perversion where I see everything as sex. But I was like, this is real. And then, so I used it. And then it's like, and those kind of serendipitous things, because the poem was so powerful and interesting, it did begin really infiltrating the script and follows through the novel. So, it was one of those wonderful research things.
Any other questions?
Yep. What kind of jobs did I do? Terrible ones, you know. The usual, like, I think, what did I do? Just like waitressing and stuff. My dad kept trying to get me to become a criminal with him, and he was like, you know, there's so much work and money in being a criminal, and that's the only life he knew. And I was like, I don't think so. I think, like, look how you live in this like shack with nothing. And he's like, I don't know, like, you'd be a good criminal. You're really good at lying and subterfuge and stuff. And I was like, yes, but this is also beneficial as a novelist. So, I just worked like really crummy jobs and waitressing and little things like that. And then when I think I was 25, I actually wrote this script a screenplay that I sold to CBC as one of their kind of like movie of the week with troubled people and stuff. And so that was really great. That was my first big paycheck. So I got like $30,000, and I was like, I'm going to take this $30,000 and just sit and write a novel with it. So that was kind of a blessing. The movie didn't do well. I remember like, I was young, so I didn't understand how to deal with reviews, but the reviews were all, I don't know why I'm sharing this, but the reviews were like, this is a terrible movie. And its main problem is the script. Like, who the hell wrote this ridiculous screenplay that makes no sense? Because all of a sudden you have a street kid who stops and is like reciting metaphors to nothing. And I was like, okay, that's because I'm developing a style, but I will perfect that. I will take 2. Thank you for the criticisms. And so I kind of went from there. And then I was doing like freelancing too while I was in my late 20s. But it was a very, very frugal existence.
Yep.
Here she comes. Hi. Yeah. Um, yeah, I'm always interested. Like, I guess all my novels have had that sort of dynamic between two people because I'm always fascinated by the way people couple and they have folie à deux, and what we create when we have these intimate relationships with other people is so insane. And they just all they do is they you know they exacerbate your eccentricities. They enable your bad behavior. No matter what bad thing you do, they're like, I'm on your side. I'm on your side. So you punched him out, and I'm on your side. What am I going to say? But anyways, I find those relationships sometimes become so enmeshed and crazy that to evolve, you have to separate. And the act of separation between an intense relationship. I mean, we've just seen with Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, in separation that's just like horrific. But I don't know why I brought those two up. It's a downer. Yeah, so they're not good for each other. And I think sometimes these kind of overly enmeshed love affairs of whatever kind of romantic or friendship are not necessarily healthy and don't let people grow. So in my books, I always do them a favor and separate them, and then they slowly work back towards each other. And then the results are terrible, but I'm like, I tried to separate you. I sent Sadie all the way off to England. Just get her away from Marie so they can be. But they just become these grand. I mean, Sadie goes to England and comes back completely like wild, and she's just a pornographer, you know, like who would thunk it? But then they get back together and it's like, you know, explosive. So, but I'm like, I tried. Yes? Okay. She asked if what the process of the book, writing the actual book was, and if what I had intended was close to what it was at the end. I think what was nice about this book, like I started it with a scaffolding of the French Revolution, but I wanted to do it in context of women's rights, which were just starting, and then the French Revolution kind of asked the question: is the lower class are they actually people with as much agency? And because back then they didn't even think they could mix. They were completely, you know, God chose the rich to be rich and the poor to be poor. But the French Revolution was all about, are poor people actually people? So then right before the first wave of feminism, women started asking, well, are women people? Which seems like an obvious question to answer, but it's been like a sort of difficult one, because if then we are people, then why are we being treated this way? And anyways, so I had the scaffolding in the French Revolution, so I kind of knew where some things were going to go, but the complexities of the characters really changed and evolved, and I think how I was going to do, I think the hardest part was when you have these kind of simultaneous histories happening, and to kind of keep the squalid mile percolating in the bottom of the story so that when it comes out, it's not like it's just abrupt. So I needed the two to make the reader conscious of both levels of the story at the same time. So, but I'm trying to think. No, but then all the twists at the end, I kind of discovered as I was writing those. It's funny, too, whenever there's a surprise in the book, I'm always surprised by it, too. And I'm like, oh, my God, why did I see that? I'm like, you're writing the book. But so that's really fun. And then when I have, like, those twists, then I go back, and I'm like, okay, now I see where things are leading. And the deepening of themes, because usually, like, with the first draft of the book, everything's very cartoonish, and everybody looking like running around, falling downstairs in their crinolines, and it almost has just this absurdist little, like, I'm playing with doll houses. So then the second and third is like I'm really getting to know the characters and deepen them and developing my themes. Thank you. Uh-huh. Okay. She wants me to talk about George, which everybody does. Everyone's like, what is George's gender? And it's such an interesting question because obviously, if you reach, I had some conversations with my editor about that, like how we were going to deal with the fact that we have a character who obviously has non-binary inclinations, but at the time she would not have had access to that terminology. So we were like, it seemed somehow normal to call George they, but they would have no pronouns at the time. So I was doing it within the context of that time of George exploring her gender, and I thought it was so interesting because she's raised in a brothel and she's kind of passed between women and from breast to breast, which is one of my favorite little scenes. And there's like the moral compass of the novel who actually is interested in seeing where female rights we can progress with them, whereas all the other characters get caught up in the revolutionary fervor and forget about this, and they just go power mad. But George is always. But I would say, she's genderqueer, but she's definitely non-binary. And I find what I've been finding fascinating too on the internet lately is people, writers like Nico Stratus or Colby Gordon, who's going into the past to kind of locate people who they consider had trans inclinations or in this era would have been trans, which I find is so fascinating because the idea of talking about it as though it's a modern thing is ridiculous because there have always been people like this. They've just had different names and not the same categorizations. But people have always felt throughout history people who didn't feel right in their gender and felt that they were something else, and they've expressed it in different ways. So I kind of find it fascinating to deal with George trying to explore this within a Victorian context.
I think we have time for just one more.
Gentleman in the back.
I'm the first person with the microphone. I thought I would get to, somewhat anonymously ask like everyone else did. You've been talking about kind of the status of women and gender, and it makes me think of this idea from one of your short stories that's stuck with me for years of the town. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name, but the town and all of the men are like the same ballet dancer that like, I don't want to say clones, but they're all like the same man, and how that affects that it's just this same guy is sort of taking over an entire town. So I always think about like where you got that idea from, and these other ideas, like I don't want to make it about men. Those are great points about women and trans people and things, but what were some of the thought processes, or how did you get that idea to make all the men this same guy that was a very certain kind of individual?
Okay, he's talking about a story I wrote, and it was a story in which these Russian scientists, during the Cold War, after Nureyev, who was their great ballet dancer, who one day in Paris just literally ran in the airport screaming, "Help me, help me, help me!" And the French customs officers were like, "Come on, come on!" And all the Russians were chasing him. So anyways, I always loved Nureyev because he was so beautiful and he was just so miserable all the time. And even when he was on the Muppet Show as a kid, he's just miserable there, and he's so so arrogant, and and just obsessed with his own beauty and his own talent. And even when the way he talks about himself was so grandiose. But it was like, this is a kid from Siberia who decided they wanted to be a ballet dancer. So you kind of needed that arrogance to get ahead. And his dancing was beautiful. So then I had this idea that these Russian scientists, after Nureyev escaped, they decided to clone him. They got some of his DNA. And they're like, oh, it doesn't matter because we will recreate Nureyev, but we won't give him this terrible childhood where he was beaten by his dad and had to dance in secret and lived in these impoverished circumstances. And then we'll have an even greater Nureyev. So anyways, the point is none of it works because they can't quite craft a child. Like, they give him too good a childhood, and then he doesn't want to create art at all because he's too well balanced. And then they give him the next generation a horrible childhood, but then it's just too bad, and they're too nihilistic and suicidal to even bother dancing. And then so what you ended up with is a secret town with all these Nureyevs, and none of them want to dance, but at the same time they're completely arrogant and miserable and at bars just complaining about the state of the world. So that was actually I think the impetus between that story was how one creates an artist, and do you need a bad childhood, or because often you do. So many artists have these difficult childhoods because it puts them on the outside and it gives them this perspective on society and how it's working, because they're always observing why don't I fit in, and then they grow up and have these just wonderful philosophical, sociological ideas of the world, even though they're completely insane. But
Great. I guess we'll end on that note, insanity. So on behalf of the Word on the Street, I'd like to thank you for attending Word on the Street. That was
thank you, Monica.
It was great talking to you. So for up next, there's a conversation with Jesse Wente on his memoir, Unreconciled, and later we'll hear from Charlie Petch, Nancy Jo Cullen, Raleigh Pemberton, and more. Thanks, everyone. Heather should be signing books somewhere very close by.